All right, today we're going to look at 5.4 in your key concept for this time period, which is all about global migrations. This is a very unique key concept because it's the only time in your AP World History key concept listing where there's a 0.4. Usually there's 1, 2, and 3, and they all have some kind of correlation typically to politics and culture and all that kind of stuff, economics. And this is the only one that has to deal with migration. And we're talking about global migration in time period 5 because obviously during 1750 and 1900, there's a ton of movement of people from one place to another, as you can probably imagine, as the Industrial Revolution has now had yet another reaction and impact on people and movement from one place to another. The picture that you see here is an illustration of the areas of the world and where movement of those people typically is seen during a margin in the 21st century. So that kind of is the end result in a kind of cool graph, the visual there for just how varied, I should say, and widespread this movement can be. And we're going to get you started here with some teacher speak, which is really the actual verbiage of key concept 5.4.I, which is all about migration. And that says that migration in many cases is influenced by changes in demography in both industrialized and the unindustrialized societies that presented challenges to existing patterns of living. And there are some caveats there, A and B. And A looks at changing in food production and medical conditions, contributing to a significant global rise in population across the board. And then B looks at the nature of new modes of transportation. We started looking at internal and external migrants relocating to cities. And of course, that pattern is typically known as urbanization as we get to the 19th century. So what does all that mean? Going back to 5.1, you read about, hopefully, the demographic transition that's occurring. If you've taken AP Human Geography or you remember your urban game that we played at a couple weeks back now, all of that stuff that we talked about then, those mechanics we told you were very important, all of that stuff is starting to matter now. So when I asked you about A typically means that there's a massive jump in the population. And we know the reasons why. Sanitation was becoming better. We were introducing more and more medical procedures that were actually being successful. You looked at how there was a little bit of a gradual rise in rate of survival when it came to childbirth. There were more kids that were being born because of need for labor and all that kind of stuff. So, use the chart here as a way to kind of look at that from 1,000 up to 2,000, which obviously, is going beyond where we need to be looking at currently. You can kind of see here the massive spike in not only the world population, but city population share, which is actually what we look at as far as percentage of people living in the city. Over time, once again, if you take human geography, you'll look at this rate. There are different levels that societies go through and stages, and as they develop from being unindustrialized into industrialized countries, you look at the rates of things like birth rate and death rate and then total population. And so we're coming out of a time period here at the beginning where most societies, even the ones in the West, were at stage 1. They had high birth rates, but they had really high death rates, and so population was low because people were being born, that's true, in more massive amounts or whatever, but they were also dying very quickly in massive amounts, and things were rough. And so as we start to industrialize and become better at this, birth rates kind of stay stagnant a little bit, but death rate starts to lower because of, once again, better medical and more food and all that kind of stuff. And so we see total population rise. And then when we get to stage 3, birth rates start to fall because now people don't need to have these giant, huge families to support themselves anymore. Now in most societies, you can get by with having 1 to 3 kids. and in the case a little bit higher in other societies. So birth rates are going down, death rates are still going down, and so obviously that total population once again is continuing to rise. And then finally in stage 4, we kind of stabilize death rates and birth rates. Those are both at low levels, and population is rising because now those kids are having kids, and we see how that goes. So those are the main 4 levels here of the demographic transition, and this is all being showcased in industrialized countries as they start to develop. So when you think about societies that we live in now, most of the Western and industrialized countries in the world today are in stage 4, where population is as a little bit higher, birth rates and death rates are kind of stagnant and stabilized. Most of your industrializing countries, your third world countries, are somewhere typically between 2 and 3 as far as the stages. There still are a few countries, however, that are in stage 1. Those are the countries that are having high birth rate, high death rate because of war or civil unrest, but their population is also lower. And when we look at B here for Roman numeral I, that's basically urbanization. If you're looking at key concept 1, 5.4.I.B is how it can be teacher speak located. That's all urbanization. So this is sometimes a chart that you might want to look at here as far as over time, going from time period 4 to the beginning stages, middle stages of time period 5, you basically have the growth of the city. Once again, we kind of touched on this a little bit during industrialization because we took a look at the rising influx of people moving from a rural population to a more urban population, because that's where the jobs are, that's where the hospitals were, that's where money was being made, that's where more food was being sent and all that kind of stuff and sold. It was better for prosperity for you to move into a city. And so for the industrialized societies, these cities, these urban centers can support more people, which leads to a really high, sharp increase in their population, and people shift, right? And so by the 1900, that last little sentence there, 10% of the world's population live in the cities. Before then, it was a lot lower, which we still think, well, 10%, that's not that much, but we're going to start to see that number spike here as we move further and further through the 20th century into the modern age. For 5.4, we also have Roman numeral 2 here, which says that migrants relocate for a variety of reasons. So teacher speak, you got to know A, B, and C. A, many individuals choose freely to relocate, usually in search of work. B, if they're not choosing freely, sometimes the global capitalist economy relies on coerced and semi-coerced labor migration. And then finally, C is, while many migrants permanently relocate, a significant number of temporary and seasonal migrants return to their home societies. A, B, and C, basically a tiered system of how your labor is being choosy of where they're going. Whether they're choosing freely, whether they're kind of forced or semi-forced into it, or whether or not they are not permanent but kind of, migrant workers that travel back and forth seasonally or temporary, as the key concept knowledge would say. A looks at, in basic detail, if you're doing free will here, you're looking at basically manual laborers and specialized professionals, people who at one point had a specialized skill or craft, and that could be a lot of different skills and crafts, but are not finding work in the rural setting or where they were currently located. So they have to move to another area where those jobs are calling because of different stuff. So, this is a really kind of crude way of looking at people who are moving and looking around for a better life. Or the classic example is the American Dream, right? Where you have immigrant groups coming from Europe, coming over to America because that's where all this land of opportunity is, right? That you've always grown up with. That's how we can become the melting pot for the world, right? Because we have all these different groups combining into one social, area. And they're looking for better and more jobs. So, when you start thinking about that, Farmers are a good example because of the Columbian Exchange that we've had happen with certain foods. Sometimes those foods run out of need for labor in certain areas, so those laborers move to another area where they're growing other foods. For the American dream, a big one is the construction industry. As we start to build those urban centers, not only in America but in other industrialized countries, that requires lots of manual labor to do construction, right? Just like today. So you have to have a steady source of those laborers, and people find work there. And then factory workers. Let's not forget, this whole is spurred on by the Industrial Revolution, and those factory systems setups are still there. And so that is a huge indicator here for this free will movement. That's the key term here. The key phrasing is free will. So manual laborers, specialized professionals move on their own accord because they want access to better and bigger things in life, whether it's money or better jobs or more stability or the American dream, whatever. This is of their own free will. And this is what helps make America one of the most quickly blossoming areas in the world at the time. B, with coerced and semi-coerced labor. That's a fancy way of saying that we still see slavery, indentured servitude, and convict labor during this time period. Slavery still ongoing until a couple of certain days here in the starting off in the 16th century there. I put a little chart to the right there, which is a really important chart because that dictates and showcases when the heavy hitters are abolishing slavery. Note that, by the early 1500s to the later part of the 18th century, a lot of your heavy countries are going through their initial waves of slavery, and then right around 1792, when Denmark starts to abolish, we start seeing, in the next 50, 60 years or so, most of the heavy hitters abolish slavery. The big one and the last to fall is Brazil in 1888. Of course, about 1865 with the United States because we have the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War being fought, and when that culminates in 65, we have legislation passed that abolishes slavery in our territory as well. This is not to say that the importation was not stopped sooner, because we stopped importing slaves much before 1865, but you still got to keep an eye on the fact that actual slavery is not abolished until those dates. You should probably know those dates in your notes somewhere. I would put those down. Indentured servitude, as far as semi-coerced labor, that is going to be taking on new racial tones here. And the two classic examples that we see for this one are Chinese and Indian laborers. And they're often called coolies. Actually, coolie is an Indian term that was given to indentured servants from India who were basically day laborers, and they worked in infrastructure industries. So once again, construction, the rapid urbanization in that area and territory is needing lots of labor that work during the day, right, because of technology concerns. And so they call them coolies. And a lot of this migration moving back and forth is going to help settle places like the Western states, the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean islands as well. You see a lot of the Chinese and Indian labor movement into these places. So in a way, you're not typically thinking of these groups of people moving to these areas like the Pacific and the Caribbean and the Western states, but lo and behold, China, with Chinese laborers, moved really heavily into California and the West. They moved very heavily into the Pacific. They moved very heavily into the Caribbean islands. And India, right behind them, is moving into places like Africa and parts of the Philippines and Southeast Asia and even Oceania with Australia and New Zealand. And then C, looked at the bottom part there was convict labor. You really see that as well picking up in certain areas. Places like Australia, for example, were founded as a penal colony where criminals and convicts were sent to do work in the territories, the colonies of Great Britain. And so You have that. Devil's Island is another famous example of a place where convict labor is used to do infrastructure projects and clearing and massive things like that. This is a really big indicator, though, for the squalid conditions that convicts are having to deal with, and so this is a really looked at and frowned upon system as time moves on because of the horrors and the misery that these people go through. To a certain extent, there's a debate going on as to whether or not we should actually care about that because of the fact that these people are criminals. But at the same time, the sheer horrors and conditions that most of them are living in is taking a nice precedent here for looking at that system. Devil's Island, for example, is not Devil's Island. It was another name, and then they started calling it Devil's Island because of the horrible and horrific conditions that these prisoners had to deal with there when it came to disease from malaria, heat, humidity, just awful conditions. So as a result, as you can probably imagine, because we're using this kind of labor in kind of negative type of ways, because it's not free will, right? This is all the awful stuff that is resulting that sometimes still exists today. In fact, all these things kind of, in a way, insist today. Bigotry, racism, social Darwinism, which is a term that you have to know, and other insert group that you don't like, hate groups, are hate laws. So we'll see a couple of examples of this later on down the road. Anti-Chinese acts, for example, were popular at the time here, coming out of this use of this labor because of other issues that resulted from bigotry and racism and social Darwinism. And then some positive lasting cultural legacies are also coming out, like settlement, right? So Chinese settling massive amounts of space in the Pacific and in Western United States, and labor being used in Australia. In Australia, there's this common joke, and this is an image here from a very famous Simpsons episode that depicts the fact that Australia was a prison colony and the effects that had on society and culture. And so the joke goes that the very first prime minister was a convict who broke out. He wasn't. He was a drunk, but he wasn't a convict. And so that kind of adds a little bit of a personal flair for the dramatic and the culturally relevant to social upbringing here as a result of this system of using non-free-willed labor for certain aspects of society building. C, which I talked about with that teacher speak a couple slides ago, and that's seasonal employees that basically move to an area but can move back to their homeland for whatever reason. And so when we think about seasonal employees, you typically think of it kind of like it's Christmas time, and so Target adds more people to work the busy time of the season and they fire them after the while, right? And that's a really simplistic way to look at it, but there is some truth to that when it comes to historically what we're doing across the world here in certain areas. And so once again, AP likes to gravitate towards certain movements here, and they ask us to kind of influence you and teach you about a few of them. So here are the big three that they typically talk about. One is the Japanese agricultural workers in the Pacific. So Japan, as you already are aware, is a very land-limited country. It's an island, or a group of islands, and so land is very limited. And so agriculturally speaking, once they kind of build up those initial farms and stuff, well, they can't keep expanding or terraforming that much land. It's not like China where you can push these borders somewhere else or whatever, or America where you can just push west and use some of those lands. So the people that are on those agricultural farms are very skilled, but they don't have any land to work. And so you actually have a Japanese diaspora happening where they're going to settle place in the Pacific as well. The main one is the Philippines. There's a huge number of mixed relations that are happening between the Philippine natives and the Japanese, and it creates a really cool, unique cultural identity in these regions that are different from, say, China or Japan by itself. Another one of the big three often mentioned are the Lebanese that are having a decent-sized merchant class, and they develop that merchant class and they move, in some cases, to America. There are push-pull factors that are happening in places like Brazil. So Brazil as an avenue for a rising kind of capitalistic system here. Merchants move there to make money. They're also trying to push their way out of Lebanon, which is kind of experiencing some, civil war type of issues that are happening abroad, right? They're doing escapism in essence. However, this is their homeland still, so they are moving back and forth between those places, trying to keep the culture in both pockets going. Brazil sees a bunch of that with Lebanon and Lebanese merchants. And then finally, we come to Argentina. There's a large Italian population in Argentina. The map here to the left shows you the basic zones of Argentina and how densely populated they were with people that were born in Italy. So as you can see, according to the 1914 census, which is just beyond our time period here, right in World War I, there are a couple of pockets of Argentina that are very saturated, or at least more saturated than we would classically think. You would think this would all be Spanish, right? Spanish settlers and Spanish culture. Well, in a way, they kind of bond Italy, Italian culture with Spain, Spanish culture. So a lot of agriculture communities are popping up in these areas, and they bond to the Spanish roots through stuff like language, stuff like cuisine, stuff like religion, obviously, because they're both Catholic, naturally. So, yeah, pretty cool how you can look at, legacies there. So if you ever meet people from Argentina, there might be some Italian history there, and that's really cool. And that's starting during this time period with movement here. Seasonal employees moving back and forth. And then finally, we come to Roman numeral 3. The large-scale nature of migration, especially in the 19th century, produces a variety of consequences and reactions to the increasingly diverse societies on the part of migrants and existing populations. So here's the result part of this, right? One is the movement, one is what happens and how it happens, and then this part 3, is all about what are the consequences of that, right? And reactions. So, of course, you have different varieties of things there. A, due to the physical nature of labor and demand, migrants are tending to be male, and that kind of changes the way that women have to take on new roles in the home society that were formerly occupied by men. B looks at ethnic enclaves being created in different parts of the world that are used to transplant culture, into new environments and such. And that's kind of working itself through the migrant support network. And then finally we come to C, which is receiving societies did not always embrace immigrants, as seen in various degrees of ethnic and racial prejudice and the ways states attempt to regulate the increasing flow of people across their borders. That's the negative part, okay? So lots of reactions and results here. So let's go into these more in depth. A, males moving away. Basically, women pick up the slack at home. So this is the beginning of the suffrage movement in a way. So keep an eye on this. Towards the same time as laws are being, enacted to protect workers, there's a shift happening at home where women are coming back home from the factories because they're being kept out for whatever reason. Women are pulling double, triple duty sometimes because sometimes they still do have to work, but the male is away, maybe moved away or something. So women are trying to, keep the home together while still maintaining a job, while still maintaining childcare and education, all that kind of stuff. This is not a dominating factor in any particular region, so it's kind of spread out along all the industrialized countries in a way. And once again, this is the beginning of the suffrage movement as we talk about women eventually wanting rights and having to reform laws that we are going to be covering here with 5.3. B looks at racial ethnic enclaves, which are basically concentrating cultural groups in certain areas, right, around culture or economic activity. A couple of great examples of this: the Chinese we just talked about earlier with Asia and the Caribbean and the west of America, South America, North America. Prima example here is Chinatown. So they come for economic interests like cigar manufacturing or fishmongering, groceries, all that kind of stuff. They kind of condense themselves into certain pockets, and now you can still go to New York and visit Chinatown. It's a pretty cool place where you can see lots of unique cultural aspects that are different than a more mixed conglomerated city. Italians, not to be outdone, have Little Italy in the same kind of basic region of New York City. Same thing. They're coming in and kind of condensing into different groups, so you can kind of see that. Indians, we talked about India with East and Southern Africa. That's a map to the right of racial concentrations and homelands. You can kind of see where some of those Indians are being settled up. Some of the largest Indian groups per population are in South Africa as opposed to being in India, obviously. And so that concentration is really showcasing itself there. Once again, this is getting to the point where, as a reaction to this migration and this kind of consolidation, unfortunately, there are some negatives there. For example, Indians are getting lumped into the same kind of quote-unquote bad racial groups that are blacks and natives are getting lumped into. So that's not a good thing moving forward. But for now, it's definitely an impactful result. So make sure you're looking at that. The center here is a map of New York City and different groups of where they're at. So if you want to take a time to blow that up, you can do that. You can see that there's Hispanic and Asian influence there in different colors, where the whites are, where the blacks are, predominantly from America or from the Caribbean. There's a lot of cool things happening in that map of historically dominated neighborhoods that are of certain ethnic groups. And then finally, C, looking at the negative results here, you've got social hatred, political bigotry. This is a period of really intensified reaction towards immigrant regulation. So a number of things to do and write down. Number one, 1862, the Anti-Coolie Act, acts designed to curb the influence and the flow of the Chinese into America. And the use of the coolie system in general. 1882, 20 years later or so, you have the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which puts an absolute 10-year moratorium on Chinese labor immigration. No Chinese immigrants could come in for those 10 years. For the first time, and especially in America, this is where you have a federal law that is designed to keep one group out of the country who is seen to be a threat. This is something that we have to look at today, as you can probably imagine. When it comes to Muslim people that are trying to come over to America, you got to look at that and the fact that there are certain candidates for election, for example, that want laws passed or whatever to keep those numbers very low, if not non-existent. The Chinese Exclusion Acts are also important because they showcase a harder path to citizenship, but deportation is even easier than it's ever been. So once again, you see some of that with some other immigrant groups that we have to deal with today in this country. So this is all very relevant information happening well back in the 1880s. Couple of things there for you on the bottom to look at. Very famous political cartoons to the left and the right, and a placard that ran in newspapers in the center there, where they actually were very anti-Chinese, extremely important to try to keep them out, as seen by natives who don't want that group infringing on their jobs and their social life, whatever. One of the last slides here, if not the last slide, you've got the Eastern edition of this. Is not happening only in the West. The great example of Eastern use of this is with Australia. In the 1850s to the mid-1940s, you have the White Australia policy, which is going to favor immigrants from certain areas of Europe and not other areas. More particularly, there is a northwestern European group that is well liked and received by Australia, and then southern and eastern varieties of Europeans are excluded from that. And Chinese as well. Huge Chinese bigotry here. There's even a test that includes a dictation test where you have to write something in a European language, and typically that European language is of the Northwest variety, so groups that can't write that and pass that test don't get to come in. The Chinese are the main target. You see laws that are including heavy taxes put on them. Those heavy taxes can't be paid, and therefore, these poor Chinese migrants and stuff can't go over. Once again, here are two famous examples as well of stuff to show you. The octopus of Chinese bigotry there, kind of entangling reasons why we should not be letting them into Australia. And then, of course, you have a little map there to the right of map of the world showing the warm countries in which the skin of humans gradually becomes brown, and the hot countries in which it gradually becomes black. So you can see what areas Australia is not wanting, that center zone there.